My husband and I are in our late 30s, happily child-free, and living our dream, or at least trying to. After almost a decade of saving, we finally moved to a tropical paradise 2 years ago. The place we found was perfect for us, a beautiful duplex on the water with plenty of dock space for our boat. It wasn't cheap, think Hawaii-level prices, but we managed to buy the larger half of the duplex, a 5-bedroom, 3-bath dream home. Our side of the property came with 90% of the backyard, a gazebo, and about 150 feet of dockage. The other half of the duplex, a much smaller 2-bedroom unit, came with a small patio, a tiny backyard, and just 15 feet of dock space. We thought the setup would give us privacy and peace. What we didn't count on were our neighbors. Karen, her boyfriend Billy Bob, and her 3 wild kids. Karen was the kind of neighbor who made you dread every interaction. Entitled, loud, and confrontational, she acted like our property was hers to use whenever she wanted. Her boyfriend, Billy Bob, was no better, a stereotypical beer-swilling, cigarette-tossing troublemaker. Together, they brought chaos to our lives in ways we could never have imagined. At first, we tried to set boundaries politely. We explained that while the previous owner of the duplex allowed tenants to share the backyard freely, things had changed now that we owned the property. We were happy to compromise if she asked nicely, but that wasn't Karen's style. She didn't ask, she demanded. What followed was a series of increasingly ridiculous incidents, from her throwing a kids' party in our backyard without permission to Billy Bob illegally parking his boat in our dock space. By the time Karen started calling the cops on us over a fence we were building on our property, we knew we had to take matters into our own hands. The whole situation spiraled into an epic battle of pettiness, police involvement, and eventually, sweet revenge. The story took an unexpected turn when we ended up buying Karen's side of the duplex and becoming her landlord, which led to some truly bizarre developments. But in the end, justice had its way. When we first moved in, Karen wasted no time asserting herself. She acted like she still had free reign over the backyard, just as she had when the previous owner rented out both units. I tried to be accommodating at first. I told her we'd appreciate if she asked before using our space, thinking that would set a reasonable boundary. Karen, however, took this as an open invitation to do whatever she pleased. One afternoon, my husband and I were enjoying a quiet day outside when a delivery truck pulled up with a massive inflatable bounce house. Confused, I asked Karen what was going on. She cheerfully announced it was her daughter's birthday party and began setting up in our backyard without so much as a request. When I told her this wasn't okay, she brushed me off, claiming it was just for today and adding, "It's a family and friends event, so you'll need to stay inside." I was floored. Not wanting to ruin a little girl's birthday, I begrudgingly let it slide, but I told Karen this was the last time. She ignored me completely. Things escalated when one of her drunk party guests wandered into our house, thinking it was hers. He apologized when I redirected him to Karen's unit, but moments later, Karen stormed into our house, screaming about how I'd embarrassed her in front of her friends. She accused us of being selfish, saying we didn't deserve all this space since we didn't have kids. That was it. I told her to get out or I'd call the cops. She left, but not without slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. From that day forward, Karen was banned from our backyard entirely. After the party debacle, my husband and I decided it was time to draw a literal line between our space and hers. We hired a contractor to build a fence and, while we were at it, decided to upgrade the backyard with a new patio, fire pit, and outdoor kitchen. When the contractors showed up, Karen wasted no time sticking her nose in. At first, I didn't tell her about the fence and only mentioned the patio. She seemed thrilled, probably thinking she'd get to enjoy the upgrades. But when the workers started putting up the fence, she lost it. Karen came outside screaming for them to stop. When I told her to butt out, she called the cops. The police showed up, listened to both sides, and then gave Karen a stern talking to about private property. She stomped back into her house, slamming her sliding door so hard I thought it might shatter. The fence went up, cutting Karen off from our backyard for good. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Karen's boyfriend, Billy Bob, soon added his own brand of chaos. He had a 30-foot fishing boat, but only 15 feet of dock space on their side of the property. One day, while we were out of town, Billy Bob decided to solve this problem by posing as us and telling one of our dock renters they had to leave. The renter, understandably upset, left a nasty review on our rental site, accusing us of breaking a verbal agreement. When I found out what had happened, I immediately called the police. Karen and Billy Bob were ordered to move the boat, but not before Billy Bob got himself arrested for punching an officer during the argument. I also filed a small claims suit against them for lost rental income, which I won, though I've yet to see a dime. After all that, we managed to convince the renters to return by offering a few months of free dockage, but the whole ordeal left us furious. By this point, my husband and I were exhausted. Dealing with Karen and Billy Bob was a full-time job, and we just wanted some peace. Then, out of nowhere, the landlord of Karen's unit approached us with an offer. He was tired of managing the property from 2,000 miles away and wanted to sell. We jumped at the chance. Within 2 weeks, we closed on Karen's side of the duplex. The landlord's only condition was that we honor Karen's lease until it expired in July, which we were happy to do. A week later, I knocked on Karen's door with a copy of her new landlord information. When she opened the door, she greeted me with a sharp, "What the fuck do you want, cunt?" I smiled sweetly and handed her the papers, letting her know rent was due Friday, and she could drop the check off with me if it was easier. For the first time, I saw Karen's face turn white. She stammered something about not knowing we were the new owners. I told her we'd honor her lease, but that she needed to start making plans because we intended to remodel the unit as soon as it was up. "Bye, Karen," I said with a grin and walked away. Karen was livid. She made it clear she wasn't going down without a fight, even though her lease was set to end in just a few months. Instead of making plans to leave, she doubled down on her usual antics. There were loud parties almost every weekend, music blasting into the early hours, and her kids were suddenly everywhere, tossing trash into our yard and even throwing lit fireworks at our boat. We called the police a few times, but nothing seemed to stick. Karen knew how to toe the line just enough to avoid serious consequences. Meanwhile, we served her with a formal notice that her lease would not be renewed, offering to prorate her rent for July and waive the termination fee if she moved out early. She ignored it. Then COVID hit. The eviction process ground to a halt, and Karen took full advantage of the situation. When her lease ended in July, she stopped paying rent altogether. While we filed for eviction, the pandemic protections made it impossible to actually enforce it. Karen grew even more smug, acting as if she'd outsmarted us. But the chaos in her own life soon caught up with her. Billy Bob, who was still facing charges from his earlier arrest, got into a massive fight with Karen and was arrested again. He never returned, leaving Karen to handle everything on her own. The kids continued to run wild, and the parties didn't stop, but Karen was visibly struggling to keep it all together. In October, the situation took an unexpected turn. Karen's mother, Susan, moved in after her own landlord chose not to renew her lease. From the moment Susan arrived, things started changing. She was horrified by Karen's behavior, and her kids as well. Susan quickly took charge, laying down the law in a way Karen never had. Within weeks, the kids were better behaved, the parties stopped, and Karen seemed to shrink into herself, sulking around the house like a teenager being grounded. Meanwhile, Susan turned out to be an absolute gem. She introduced herself to us immediately and apologized for the trouble Karen had caused. Before long, she and I were sharing drinks in the backyard and baking together on weekends. Thanksgiving and Christmas that year were some of the best we'd had in a long time. With travel restrictions in place, Susan and I put together a huge outdoor feast and even managed to get Karen to participate pleasantly. For the first time since we'd moved in, things felt calm. Susan eventually revealed that she wanted to move back to her home state and take Karen with her. Karen, it seemed, was finally ready for a change, though the logistics of moving during a pandemic made things tricky. In the meantime, Susan insisted on paying rent, even though I told her not to worry about it. To ease the burden, I lied about the amount, charging her only half so it just covered taxes and insurance. We drew up a month-to-month lease and agreed to revisit the situation when things settled down. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't in a rush to see Karen go. By the time December rolled around, life had settled into an odd but peaceful rhythm. With Susan in charge, Karen and her kids had become tolerable neighbors, and I genuinely enjoyed the time I spent with Susan. We'd chat over drinks, bake together, and even help each other with holiday decorations. It felt surreal to go from Karen's chaos to this unexpected calm. Karen, for her part, was noticeably subdued. I'm not sure if it was Susan's influence, the absence of Billy Bob, or just sheer exhaustion from the mess her life had become. Whatever the reason, she seemed resigned to follow Susan's lead. Even her kids had mellowed out, behaving better under their grandmother's watchful eye. Susan was upfront about her plans to move back home once the pandemic chaos eased. She talked about wanting to help Karen start fresh somewhere far away from all the drama she'd created here. I could tell Karen was reluctant, but at least she seemed to be considering it seriously. By the time the new year rolled around, my husband and I had adjusted our expectations. Initially, we planned to remodel Karen's unit and move my elderly parents in, but with Susan running the show and Karen behaving herself, we decided there was no harm in waiting a little longer. Besides, it gave us time to plan and save for the remodel we envisioned. In the end, things didn't unfold how I'd imagined when we first bought the other side of the duplex. What started as a nightmare with Karen turned into an unlikely truce, thanks to Susan's arrival. I don't know how long the peace will last or when Karen and her family will eventually move on, but for now, I'm enjoying the quiet. And if Karen ever goes back to her old ways, well, let's just say I'm ready for her. After all, this is my paradise now. If you enjoyed this saga, don't forget to follow my channel for more stories about life, drama, and everything in between. Share your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled your own neighbor nightmares.